how do you survive a winter that seems determined to eat you first? That is the question behind the Viking table. When people imagine the Vikings, they picture axes, ships, shields, and frozen seas. They imagine men fighting storms and enemies. But hunger was often a more patient enemy than any army. Hunger did not always come as sudden starvation. Sometimes it came as thinning butter stores. Sometimes it came as hay running short. Sometimes it came as one weak cow, one failed grain harvest, one storm too many, or one spring that arrived too late. And that is what makes the subject so gripping, because endless winter is not just cold. Endless winter is arithmetic. Every mouth must be counted. Every animal must be weighed against the hay left in the shed. Every slab of dried fish, every sack of grain, every wheel of cheese, every barrel of weak beer, every patch of grazing land, every day until spring. The Viking world was built by people who understood that survival was not only bravery, it was planning. Winter does not kill all at once. The National Museum of Denmark makes the basic reality plain. Viking households needed large amounts of energy in the form of fat, especially in winter, and their food culture had to be planned and adapted to the seasons. Meat, fish, cereals, vegetables, berries, fruit, and milk products all mattered. But so did timing, storage, and self-sufficiency. Most people were farmers with domestic animals and crops, and that meant winter survival began months before the first snow or hard frost. The Vikings did not fight hunger only in winter. They fought it in summer. They fought it during harvest. They fought it when cutting hay. They fought it while slaughtering animals in autumn. They fought it while drying berries, smoking meat, grinding grain, brewing beer, and salting butter. Winter was only the final exam. The real battle took place in advance, when the land still offered enough life to be stored. By the time snow falls, the outcome may already be decided. One small clue survives in a poem. On the National Museum's Viking food page, a typical meal is illustrated through a verse in which Thor says he ate herring and oatmeal before setting out and is still full. It is a modest detail, but it reveals something essential. Viking food, at least on ordinary days, was not designed for luxury. It was designed for staying power. Herring and oatmeal could fill the body, travel well, and hold off hunger longer than showier food. And that is where the mythology becomes domestic. The Viking answer to winter hunger began with grain. The National Museum of Denmark notes that rye and barley were the most important cereals, while oats, millet, and some wheat were also cultivated. Grain became bread, porridge, and beer. Wheat was comparatively rare and associated more with wealth, but rye and barley were dependable staples. Porridge, especially, appears as one of the central daily foods, particularly for poorer households. In other words, when winter closed in, the Viking household did not depend only on meat. It depended on grain that could be stored, ground, boiled, and stretched. That matters because grain does something dramatic to a society. It turns summer sunlight into winter survival. A successful harvest could be dried and stored. A failed harvest could shadow a family for months. And the agricultural changes of the Viking Age mattered here too. The National Museum notes that the moldboard plow increased yields compared with earlier tools, which meant that better cultivation could directly strengthen a community's resistance to hunger. Farming technology was not glamorous, but it was one of the reasons more people could survive the dark season. Sometimes the real weapon is a plow. But grain alone was not enough. If winter lasted, the body needed fat. The National Museum's food materials are unusually blunt on this point. The Vikings needed all the energy they could get in the form of fat, especially in winter. Milk products became crucial here. Cows, sheep, and goats provided milk, and that milk could be turned into cheese, butter, and whey products. Heavily salted butter, the museum notes, kept longer, and these conserved dairy products became an invaluable source of fat during long winters. This is one of the great hidden engines of Viking survival. Milk spoiled quickly. Butter and cheese could outlast the season. And now the longhouse begins to look different. You are not only seeing a farm, you are seeing a conversion machine. Grass becomes milk, milk becomes butter, butter becomes stored calories. And stored calories become the difference between weakness and strength in February. That chain is why hay mattered almost as much as food itself. If hay failed, cattle weakened. If cattle weakened, milk declined. If milk declined, winter fat disappeared. Hunger in the Viking world often began in the meadow. Before people starved, fodder starved. That truth is preserved vividly in Hensa Thoris saga. In one of the most revealing winter passages in the saga corpus, a poor hay year leads to shortages so severe that tenants run out of feed. Blundkettel had already ordered that animals should be slaughtered in autumn to reduce the burden on winter stores. Some tenants failed to do so and later came begging for help. When the misery spread, Blundkettel had 160 horses driven in and killed the worst 40 so that the feed intended for those animals could be given to his desperate tenants. Even then, the weather worsened and conditions became hopeless for many. This is not an abstract famine myth. It is a brutal lesson in Viking arithmetic. Too many animals alive could mean too many animals dead later. That is one of the hardest truths in the whole story. Mercy sometimes meant slaughter. Modern people often imagine the autumn kill as abundance, a season of meat, feasting, and security. It was that, but it was also a necessary reduction. The National Museum notes that animals were slaughtered in autumn and that meat and fish were then dried, smoked, or salted for preservation. The Viking Ship Museum's educational food booklet says much of the summer harvest from fields and gardens, together with meat, was saved for the winter, and that preservation happened through drying, smoking, and salting because refrigeration did not exist. In other words, autumn was not just harvest time, it was triage. Winter began with a knife, and no preserved food symbolized that better than dried fish. The Viking Ship Museum's food guide states that dried fish was widely eaten and even notes that Njal's saga mentions large quantities of dried fish for winter provisions. Before it could be eaten, the fish had to be beaten into flakes or soaked and boiled until tender. The National Museum also emphasizes that fish were central in many coastal diets, with herring especially important and probably preserved in brine at places like Hedeby. This matters because fish converted a seasonal catch into a storable reserve that could survive the worst months. Dried fish is not a romantic food. That is why it worked. It could hang, it could wait, it could travel, it could be rationed. It could keep a family going after fresh meat was gone and before new growth appeared. A society with stockpiles of dried fish was not safe from hunger, but it was safer than one that trusted only fresh slaughter. And in some areas, especially near the coasts, fish may have been one of the most dependable answers to the winter gap. Some winters were survived one hard mouthful at a time. The same principle governed fruit and berries. The National Museum notes that wild fruit and berries were abundant, including raspberries, bilberries, plums, wild apples, and hazelnuts. The Viking Ship Museum's food booklet adds that grain, vegetables, fruit, and berries from the year's harvest were dried, whether in the sun or using the warmth of the hearth. These foods were not the main winter calories, but they mattered. They added sweetness, variety, and nutrition to a season otherwise dominated by grain, dairy, preserved fish, and meat. They were also another example of a larger Viking instinct. When the land was giving, nothing useful should be wasted. That instinct shaped the entire household economy. Nothing was gathered without a winter reason. Nothing was stored without a winter memory. And because water itself could be unsafe, the Vikings even fought hunger and thirst through brewing. The National Museum states that both weak and strong beer were made from barley, and that weak beer could be consumed by adults and children because plain water could be dangerous. This was not merely recreation, it was a survival fluid. It also helped wash down salty preserved foods and added a caloric edge to daily life. A hungry society cannot afford to despise liquid. Calories. Even the cup had to work. The picture becomes even sharper when we move north and west into Greenland. A major 2018 study on the Norse settlement of Greenland shows how heavily winter survival depended on a carefully timed seasonal round. The settlers introduced livestock and agriculture to a subarctic environment, built their economy around hay fodder, and stored resources to survive low productivity periods. The same study notes that from November to April, activity was relatively limited compared with the highly compressed summer season, and that longer winters reduced dairy production by increasing livestock mortality. As climate cooled, Norse Greenlanders shifted toward heavier use of marine resources, eventually drawing as much as about 80% of their diet from the sea in the settlement's later phases. That is an extraordinary adaptation. When the fields gave less, the sea had to give more, Seal hunting, seabirds, and exchange networks became more important, especially as climate pressure intensified. The Greenland study also notes evidence of seal and seabird bones even on inland farms, implying pooled labor and exchange between households. This is crucial. Endless winter could not always be beaten by one isolated farm. Sometimes it took networks, shared labor, and the movement of food from coast to inland settlement. Hunger was fought socially as well as agriculturally. No one stores enough alone forever. That social dimension appears in saga literature too. In Hensa Thoris saga, the crisis is not only about hay, it is about who will help whom when reserves fail. Tenants appeal to a landlord. A landlord kills animals to free feed. Men go to another farmer to try to buy hay. Behind the conflict is a simple moral pressure. Those who have extra stores are expected to sell or share when others are on the edge. That does not mean Viking society was soft. It means winter hunger forced questions of obligation into the open, and obligation could become explosive. Because stored food is never just food, it is power. If you control butter, hay, dried fish, malt, or slaughtered meat when everyone else is thinning out, you control the future. That is why winter scarcity turns social tension into drama in so many medieval societies. The Vikings were no exception. Food was wealth in a form that could rot, vanish, or save lives. That made it morally charged, politically sensitive, and emotionally volatile. The storage room could decide who stood proud in spring and who entered it ruined. The hungriest season also reveals the strongest man. But there was another layer to the fight against hunger. The Vikings had to plan not only for themselves, but for animals. A typical Viking household in an agricultural area, according to the National Museum, possessed cattle, horses, pigs, sheep, and goats, along with poultry. These animals were food, labor, status, transport, milk, wool, and raw materials, all at once. They were wealth on the hoof. But through winter they also became liabilities if fodder ran short. That is why the saga example of autumn slaughter is so revealing. It reflects a real subsistence logic seen much more broadly in northern farming systems. You could not keep more mouths alive than your hay and stores could support. And this is where endless winter becomes terrifying. Because every decision cuts both ways. Kill animals in autumn, and you reduce fodder pressure, but lose future milk, labor, breeding stock, and prestige. Keep too many alive, and you risk mass death later, which may leave you with weaker herds and no feed. There is no painless choice. The Viking winter economy was balanced on such decisions year after year. Hunger was not only about what people ate, it was about what they dared to keep alive. Every animal alive in October was a question asked of March. Even feast culture belongs in this story. The National Museum notes that strong beer and mead were consumed on festive occasions, and English observers sometimes described Vikings as gluttonous. At first glance, feasting sounds like the opposite of hunger. But in a seasonal economy, feasting also had a practical rhythm. It concentrated consumption at key moments, especially after slaughter, when fresh meat was abundant but difficult to preserve indefinitely without work. Feast and storage were not opposites. They were twin responses to the same calendar. One celebrated abundance. The other tried to make abundance last. And after the feast came the long silence, hard chewing of dried fish, the daily pot of porridge, the measured use of butter, the stew stretched with onions, roots, or beans, the weak beer, the grain ground by hand, the waiting for daylight and thaw. The Viking Ship Museum's food guide reflects this ordinary rhythm well. For much of the population, it says, everyday food would have been porridge made from barley or oats, sourdough rye, bread with butter, cheese, or perhaps sausage, while hot meals were mainly soups and stews of meat, fish, and vegetables. That is the winter table in its most realistic form, not a hall overflowing with boar every night. A disciplined menu built to endure. Hunger is rarely dramatic at first, it is repetitive. And repetitive hunger leaves traces in the bones of a culture. The Viking Ship Museum notes that preserved skeletons show Vikings rarely reached old age and often had arthritis and worn or missing teeth. This does not prove famine in every case, but it reminds us that Viking life was physically costly even when society survived. Winter fighting did not always mean skeletal collapse. Often it meant chronic strain, hard labor, and nutrition that was enough to continue, but not enough to spare the body. Survival should not be confused with comfort. That is important because the phrase "fought hunger" can mislead us. It suggests victory. Sometimes the Vikings did win. Sometimes they did not. Sometimes they merely delayed defeat until spring. The Greenland evidence is especially sobering. As climate cooled and sea ice patterns shifted, longer winters harmed home field productivity and livestock survival, undermining dairy output and making the seasonal round harder to maintain. The Norse responded by increasing marine foods, but even flexible adaptation had limits. Endless winter is survivable only as long as each backup system still works. When the backup plan begins to fail, winter changes shape. And yet the most impressive part of the story remains the scale of foresight. To survive a Viking winter, a household had to think in seasons at once. Summer was for grazing, fishing, burying, and drying. Harvest was for grain and hay. Autumn was for slaughter, smoking, brewing, and salting. Winter was for rationing, enduring, and hoping the stored mathematics had been done correctly. That is why the National Museum's simple phrase about food planning is so powerful. Viking housekeeping had to be planned and adapted to the different seasons. That sentence contains an entire civilization's struggle with hunger. It was never only about appetite. It was about foresight. It was about labor. It was about saying no in the season of yes so that life would remain in the season of no. And it was about remembering that a winter pantry is built by many hands. Someone cuts hay. Someone dries berries. Someone churns butter. Someone smokes fish. Someone grinds grain. Someone decides which animals must die. Someone watches the stores. Someone stretches the stew. In the Viking world, hunger was fought inside the household before it was defeated at the table. That is how a civilization resists the dark, by preparation so ordinary it becomes invisible. There was also an important difference between regions. A farming household in inland Denmark could not fight hunger exactly the way a coastal settlement at Hedeby or a Greenland farm in the fjords did. The National Museum notes that Al-Tartushi described the people of Hedeby as relying heavily on fish, and that as many as 26 types of fish were available there, with herring probably preserved in brine. Archaeological finds of nets, hooks, eel spears, and fish bones support that picture. In other words, Viking winter strategies were local. The principle stayed the same. Store what your landscape gives best. But what the landscape gave best could change dramatically from one coast or valley to another. The clever household did not copy nature. It listened to it. That is why vegetables and gathered plants deserve more respect than they usually get in Viking stories. The Viking Ship Museum's food booklet lists peas, beans, cabbage, onions, garlic, and leeks from gardens, alongside gathered plants and herbs such as angelica, thyme, juniper, and bog myrtle. The same source notes that everyday hot meals were often soups and stews. That is important because soups and stews are hunger-fighting foods. They soften older meat, stretch small portions, combine grains and vegetables, and make preserved food easier to digest in cold weather. A thin resource base becomes more usable once it enters the pot. A pot over the fire is not just cooking. It is strategy made visible, and cooking technology helped that strategy. The Viking Ship Museum notes finds of roasting spits, boiling vessels, pans, querns, churns, bowls, and ladles, showing that households had a working kitchen economy designed for processing and extending food. Grain had to be ground. Whey had to be separated. Butter had to be worked. Meat had to be boiled, smoked, or dried. Nothing about winter food was passive. It demanded constant transformation. Stored food does not save you by itself. It still has to be made useful. There is one more reason the Vikings could hold off hunger longer than we might expect. They were willing to live on repetition. Modern palates often expect novelty. Viking survival often depended on not expecting novelty at all. The same porridge again. The same bread again, the same dried fish again, the same butter ration again, the same stew, only slightly altered by onions, herbs, or whatever remained. Repetition is psychologically difficult, but it is economically powerful. A society that accepts repetitive food can stretch stored staples far more effectively than one that insists on variety. The archaeology of Viking food and the museum reconstructions both point toward that disciplined simplicity. And so the Viking winter meal, stripped of romance, becomes something even more impressive. It is a lesson in restraint and in teaching the stomach to obey the season. That may be why the story of Viking hunger is not one of dramatic starvation alone. It is the quieter drama of thousands of correct decisions made before starvation arrived. Hay cut in time, grain dried properly, fish hung long enough, butter salted hard enough, animals culled soon enough, stores guarded carefully enough. Help sought before pride became fatal. Those decisions rarely become legend, but without them, there would have been far fewer Vikings left to make legends at all. And maybe that is the most revealing thing of all. The Vikings are remembered for movement, but winter survival depended on staying put, staying disciplined, and staying accurate. Their ships brought them fame, their storage brought them spring, their raids made them feared, their porridge, butter, dried fish, cheese, and hay made them possible. If we want to know how they fought hunger during endless winters, the answer is not a single heroic meal. It is an entire system of preservation, culling, brewing, drying, storing, exchanging, and rationing that turned short northern abundance into long northern endurance. And even then, the margin could be razor thin. One poor hay crop, one colder spring, one delayed fish run, one sick cow, one household too proud to slaughter early, one neighbor unwilling to share, one winter longer than the last. That is what made the Vikings struggle with hunger so human. They were not dining inside legend. They were negotiating with scarcity, and year after year, enough of them succeeded to build farms, towns, trade routes, and sagas across some of the most demanding environments in Europe and the North Atlantic. Spring was never guaranteed. It had to be reached. So why did the Vikings not simply starve during endless winters? Because they built a culture that treated food as strategy. They stored grain because snow was coming. They dried fish because storms were coming. They salted butter because pasture would vanish. They brewed beer because water could not always be trusted. They slaughtered animals in autumn because fodder was finite. They exchanged food across households because isolation was deadly. They shifted toward marine hunting when farms yielded less. They lived by a calendar in which every full belly in summer had to answer for February. That is the real answer. Not abundance, not fearlessness, preparation. And in the Viking world, preparation was the closest thing hunger ever had to an enemy.